Thank you very much. Let's see if this works. So, my name is Jim Kalbach. I'm the head of customer success at Mural. And that tune that we just played was called All Blues. And we are Mode Shift. Didn't know we had a name, but we do have a name. And I'd like to introduce the band now. So, hi, I'm Jim. Andy. Andy, this is Jim. Ben. Jim.
I do, man.
Hi, how
Nice
are
to
you?
meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Little joke. Just a little joke. But we met about an hour ago. So we've not rehearsed that tune. We've never played together before. So that was something of an experiment, but pretty low risk for us. But seriously, on drums, Andy Haig. Andy Haig on drums. Jim Blomfield on keyboard. Jim Blomfield. And Ben Waghorn on tenor saxophone. Okay. So we are Mode Shift. This is a project that I have, and I've done this talk before. So we're going to do it here for you today in Bristol. That song was called All Blues, and it's from a very famous album, probably the most famous jazz album of all time, called All Blues. And this is an album that Miles Davis recorded in 1959. And he went into the studio with a group of musicians and gave the musicians the music after they entered the studio. So his band didn't know that they were going to record the songs that they recorded before they got into the studio. And they rehearsed maybe just a few warm-ups just to figure out some licks, but they essentially recorded the album, and every take, except for one exception, each first complete take was the only complete take. So he assembled a band of musicians, didn't tell them what they were going to be playing, entered the studio, and produced the greatest jazz album of all time. By the way, even if you're not a jazz fan, get that album, you'll like it. So everybody should go get that album. But we ask ourselves, how is that possible, right? How can a group of people come together and collaborate in such a way that they produce such great music spontaneously? And this gives rise to what I call radical collaboration. And what we want to do today, is kind of expose some of the inner workings of how a group here in front of you today can get up on stage and without rehearsal and never meeting each other, that we can play pretty decent music for you, and how that happens. And I think there are a couple of key factors, and there's lots of, in fact, we heard lots of the themes this morning, and pretty much as every talk was going on this morning, I was thinking of how it relates to my talk, so I may give some shout outs to everybody that went before me in the talk. This is a picture from that recording session, by the way. Miles Davis on trumpet there, there's John Coltrane on saxophone, and Cannonball Adderley, and Bill Evans on piano. But I think there are three things that we need to think about when we think about radical collaboration. And the first is empathy. And I don't mean empathy for the audience, I mean empathy for each other. And it's not that we're feeling what everybody else is feeling, it's an understanding. We have a shared perspective up here, and that's instant, it's spontaneous that we get that shared perspective. The other thing is embracing uncertainty, right? We didn't know in what order the solos were gonna happen. There could have been a bass solo, I kind of waved it off. We didn't know how long a solo Jim was going to take. So we kind of knew the song, but we didn't actually know how it was going to end. We didn't know the end point before we started that song. And finally, following patterns and frameworks. Contrary to a popular opinion about jazz, it's not just made up here spontaneously. There's actually a wealth of frameworks and patterns that we have that we rely on. And that's what I want to start with. So I want to talk about those 3 points, empathy, uncertainty, and patterns, and I want to start with patterns. So there are lots of patterns of jazz, and when you study jazz and learn how to play jazz, you're effectively learning the patterns of jazz so that you have them under your fingertips and that they're internalized. There are patterns in melody, for instance. There are patterns in harmony that repeat themselves, and once you learn these patterns, then you can combine them in different ways spontaneously. So a lot of jazz is improvised. That was improvised music. But it's based on a lot of patterns that we know. But one of the biggest patterns that governs a lot of jazz music is the form of a piece of music. So there's a structure, there's a set form that we were playing. And the piece that we just played called All Blues has what's called a 12-bar blues form. And what this is it's 12 measures. Each measure is 4 beats, right? And there are 12 measures with a fixed set of harmonies. In that case, it was 4 measures of G, 2 measures of a C, then 2 measures of a G, Then we went D, E flat, D, and back to G. That adds up 12 measures. When we're done with that, we play that over again. And Ben played the melody twice. And then when we were done with that, we played that over again, but Ben took his solo. So the soloist is effectively improvising a melody on top of that form. In the background, we were playing those same 12 bars. And we just kept going over and over those same 12 bars, so that when you get to the end of it, the only question is Ben going to take another solo, or are we going to switch to Jim? When Jim was taking his solo, which he did the same thing, by the way, the only question was I going to take a solo, or Andy, or were we going to go back to the melody? That's called a chorus, by the way. So in jazz music, we call that a chorus. I don't know how many choruses Ben took, four or five, or four maybe, 3 or 4? I don't know. Three, took 3 choruses. Could have been 4, could have been a lot more. But that's how we know where we are, right? We're orienting ourselves to this form. And if you think about it, it's a lot like a sprint, right? Because if we got off track, or if we messed up, right, we would know how to orient ourselves to the beginning of that form. And that happens every once in a while, where you lose the form, and it can be deadly if somebody loses the form, but you listen to each other, and then you get back into the form. So getting out of the form is not a good thing, but you always know how to get back into it, because that form is always there. So there's this underlying sense of time. There's this duration of 12 bars, and those harmonies keep going. That's what we're playing in the background behind Ben's solo. There's another common form. So the 12-bar blues is the most common form. Lots of variations of that. There's also a 16-bar form, which is often broken up into 8 measures and 8 measures, so you have these kind of 2 sections. But again, it's the same pattern. This is one chorus. You play the melody, and then you keep playing those 16 measures over and over again for the soloists. And then the most common form 12-bar blues is the most common form, but another common form is a 32-bar form that is broken up into 4 sections, and we call it AABA, because the melody repeats, the first 8 bars repeats, and then there's a contrasting B section, and then you repeat the melody at the end. So you get the melody stated 3 times with slight variations, but that makes up 32 bars. If we had a 32-bar tune, which we'll probably play later, we're still playing that chorus, and we know where we are at all times because we're all following the same form. So we want to demonstrate form a little bit, and we want to play a 16-bar tune right now. This is a non-standard tune, but you wouldn't have heard it anyway, even if it were a standard. And this tune is called Hot Barbecue, and it has, in beat, I think it's measure 14, there's a drum break. And Andy will play this drum break, and in that drum break, we'll do it for you, but we want all of you, to say the words hot barbecue, okay? So there's a point in this tune where we'll go hot barbecue, and every time we get to that point in the tune, I want you guys to say hot barbecue, right? What I want you to feel is the iterative nature of jazz. It's highly iterative, kind of like a sprint. So here's hot barbecue. And by the way, these guys, we've never played this together, and these guys just learned the tune this morning or something? Yeah. So, what's that? Yeah. So we got four measures out front, right? Barbecue. Hot barbecue. barbecue. Hot barbecue. Hot barbecue. Barbecue. Hot barbecue. Hot barbecue. Yeah. All right, the hot barbecue. Yeah, hot barbecue. Excellent. So, did you get a sense of the pattern then? It's just, how many times did you say hot barbecue? Anybody counting? Just over and over and over. It's a very repetitive form, but I think it's the surface where all the interest comes, right? So you're listening to Ben's solo or Jim's solo, and it's what they do on top of that where the interest comes. And then you have this foundation, this unchanging foundation. So this idea of relying on patterns, I think, for our work is really interesting when we think about design work. We talked about a few already today. There were a mention of a few, but the question is, what are the patterns of design? And I don't mean design patterns. I mean patterns of practice. What are the patterns of our behavior when we design that we could go? And I was just telling the guys, I did this gig in Bulgaria. So I go to Sofia, Bulgaria, and I got a jazz group together, and we did pretty much the same thing, and they knew all the patterns too. Guess what? If I went to Kuala Lumpur, they would know all the patterns. This is universal. This drives jazz, and it's what allows us to improvise. So what are some patterns of practice of design? Any thoughts? I'm going to ask, open it up, open mic. Mike, you're looking like you got something on mind.
Well, I guess that multidisciplinary collaboration.
Okay, multidisciplinary collaboration. But is there something specific that we have? That we could say, okay, we're going to do an XYZ now, and everybody knows exactly what you're talking about.
No, that's the problem.
There are some, I think, coming out, but I don't think there are, and I don't think there are enough. I'll give you an example. A design studio. Do you know from Lean UX, the idea of a design studio? Right? You go in, you time box, you do 6 up sketches, you select one, then everybody sketches for another time box. You can go around, if anybody knows that method, just say, we're going to do a design studio. Everybody who knows that has the same expectation, right? A lot of the game storming, who was talking about game storming today? Was that Jason had brought up game storming? A lot of those, they're not in the kind of canon of our practice, but those are the types of things that allow us to not worry about structure. And I think a lot of times when we do design, we're more worried about the process. As we're in the process, we're more worried about the process than the surface sometimes. So basically what I'm suggesting is just figure out the form and then let that go. And then you can be a lot more freer on the surface once you have those patterns down. So I think we need a lot more patterns in design practice than we currently have, and it drives a lot of the music here on stage. So the second point that I wanted to talk about is embracing uncertainty. And I want to read a quote. It's a longer quote, so this will be the storytelling section part of the talk. This is from Herbie Hancock's autobiography, which came out in 2014, last year. Herbie Hancock, a famous piano player, got to start, had a little bit of a solo career, but then played with Miles Davis. Some of us may know him from the 80s from the hit Rocket, but he's still active and producing great music, so kind of a living legend, Herbie Hancock. And he comes out with his autobiography called Possibilities. And this is the opening page. These are the opening sentences. I'm on stage at a concert hall in Stockholm, Sweden in the mid-1960s playing with the Miles Davis Quintet. We're on tour and the show's really heating up. The band is tight, we're all in sync, all on the same wavelength, and everything feels magical, like we're weaving a spell. And Tony Williams, the drummer prodigy who joined Miles as a teenager, is on fire. Ron Carter's fingers are flying up and down the neck of the bass, and Ron Shorter's saxophone is just screaming. The five of us have become one entity, shifting and flowing with the music. We're playing one of Miles's classics, So What? And as we hurtle towards Miles' solo, it's the peak of the evening. The whole audience is on the edge of their seats. As Miles starts playing, building up his solo, and just as he's about to really let loose, he takes a breath. And right then, I play a chord that is so wrong. I don't even know where it came from. It's the wrong chord in the wrong place, and now it's hanging out there like a rotten piece of fruit. I think, oh shit. It's as if we've been building this gorgeous house of sound, and I accidentally put a match to it. Miles pauses for a fraction of a second, and then he plays some notes that somehow, miraculously, make my chord sound right. In that moment, I believe my mouth actually fell open. What kind of alchemy was this? And then Miles just took off from there, unleashing a solo that took the song in a new direction. The crowd went absolutely crazy. I was in my early 20s and had already been playing with Miles for a couple of years by this time. But he always was capable of surprising me, and that night, when he somehow turned my chord from a wrong to a right, he definitely did. In the dressing room after the show, I asked Miles about it. I felt a little sheepish, and Miles just winked at me with a hint of a smile behind his chiseled face. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Miles wasn't one to talk a lot about things when he could just show us something instead. It took me years to fully understand what happened in that moment on stage. As soon as I played that chord, I judged it. In my mind, it was a wrong chord, but Miles never judged it. He just heard sound that had happened, and he instantly took it on as a challenge. A question, how can I integrate that chord into everything else we're doing? Miles trusted the band, he trusted himself, and he always encouraged us to do the same. This was one of my many lessons that I learned from Miles. We all have a natural tendency to take the safe route, to do what we all know will work rather than taking a chance. But that's the antithesis of jazz, which is all about being in the present. Jazz is about being in the moment at every moment. It's about trusting yourself to respond on the fly. If you allow yourself to do that, you can never stop exploring. You never stop learning in music or in life. So that's how he frames his whole life story with that quote. And I think there's some interesting things in there. He mentions trust. But he also mentions about taking a mistake as an opportunity. And Jason was talking about blame this morning, right? And that's the easy thing to do, right? Miles was the leader then. He was already huge. Herbie Hancock's in his 20s. He could have just turned around and yelled at him or pointed his finger at him. But he took it on as a challenge, right? Because there's this phrase, there are no mistakes in jazz, right? The only mistake is not responding to something that somebody else does and turning it into an opportunity. And I think that's the kind of one of the themes of that story there, which is pretty good in terms of uncertainty. So, like I said, we've never practiced before. We never played together. I don't think anybody here feels uncomfortable what we're doing. There's almost no fear here on the stage. We're very comfortable with what we're doing, and we're going to play a tune now. Again, we've never rehearsed this before. We're not sure where it's going to go, but we'll give it a try. This one is by John Coltrane, I think we said, right? Yeah. Let's do a John Coltrane tune then, called Equinox. Maybe I'll do some fours. Like that? Let's do 4 measures out front. 2, 1, 2, 3, Just a couple of quick observations. There was a drum solo in there, right? It's typical pattern that called fours or trading fours, where we have that form. So that was a blues form, by the way. A minor blues form consisted of 12 bars. We kept repeating those 12 bars over and over again. After the bass solo, we did what were called trading fours. And what happens is, I guess, Ben, you took the first 4 measures of that 12-bar form, and then Andy took the middle 2. So that drum break that you heard was actually in the form. It was the middle 4 measures of that form. Then we played a solo, and you keep doing that over and over again. We did that 4 times through the form, we kept trading 4 measures for 4 measures for 4 measures. That's a typical pattern in jazz. Again, you could go anywhere around the world and say, let's trade 4s, or just signal it, and then everybody would know what you're doing. So if you're wondering, how did we get a drum solo in there? That's because that's a standard pattern. And there was nothing quite surprising about that for you guys, right? We were just kind of looking at each other and listening to each other. But we didn't know we were going to do that. We didn't know in what order the solos were going to be and those kinds of things. So the song that we just played, though, I think we all have this in our ears, right? How many times have you heard that song or heard versions of that song in your life? So you have this idea of where it's going, right? We didn't know how it was actually going to end up, though. So this is a picture of the Clintons back when in their college years, right? You don't necessarily know where you're going to end up, but that's okay, right? Because here's another example, right? This is the first version of the Twitter website, right? They didn't know what a hashtag was going to be, right? They didn't plan the hashtag, they let it happen. So when you're embracing uncertainty, like we heard in the story with Miles Davis, you have these potential disruptions to what you think you're doing that then become opportunities. And they jumped on the opportunity, just like when Herbie Hancock played the wrong chord, they jumped on the opportunity of a hashtag. But it wasn't built into their business model or anything they had ever planned. So the idea of being open-minded, a lot of times jazz musicians talk about having a beginner's mind, being open to new things that might happen. And that's important for embracing uncertainty. But we did have a vision. I think we shared an outcome. Like we all had an idea of what an ideal might be for that tune because we have the original in our head. And even just the ending. We knew how to end that tune just because there's a classic ending for that tune that we all kind of knew. So we have this vision, this idea of where we're going to go, but we don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen between now and then. And that's okay. This is a photo of Sonny Rollins. We were talking about being original, right? And being original is hard. He actually took a sabbatical, also in, I think, 1959. He took a sabbatical for 3 years, and every day went out onto the Williamsburg Bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn and just played his saxophone. And anytime he heard something that he had played before, or that he heard himself playing before, he'd stop and take the saxophone out of his mouth and then play again. He basically wanted everything that came out of his mouth to be original, out of his saxophone to be original. So this idea of being unique and original on the surface is also something that we're striving to do. But we have that safety net of the patterns, right? So if you have those patterns, it allows you to embrace uncertainty and capitalize on opportunities that you might not have planned on. So how do we brace? How does design? Talking about what is it? Guilty by association, right? We like to think that we're the creative types, but sometimes we actually hold back. And we're not necessarily taking risks and pushing and afraid to make. Sometimes we're afraid to make mistakes, right? So I don't know. What do you guys think? Are we as a discipline, are we good at embracing uncertainty? In jazz, it is. In fact, jazz thrives on uncertainty. The best jazz is on the brink of destruction. And you heard in the solos there, as Jim started playing, then Andy started reacting to that. And we started listening to each other and reacting to that. And then the beat starts, we start pushing the boundary, right? We get out of our comfort zones. And that's what jazz musicians thrive on. Immediately, I want to be out of my comfort. I want to be on the edge. I don't want to be in the center all the time. You're shaking your head, Mike?
I'm nodding my head. Because that's agile, right? It's responding to change over following the plan.
It's responding to change, right? While following the plans, right? And that's what agile is supposed to be. That's pivoting and stuff like that. I think sometimes we get wrapped up in process ourselves, though, too. So don't be guilty of not taking risks. I think it's super important to take risks, particularly in our discipline. So the last topic that I wanted to talk about was empathy, and we have all these different ways that we gain empathy for other people. This is an example of a museum. This one was in Germany, but I believe they did an exhibit here in London as well, too. It's called Dialogue in the Dark. Does anybody know Dialogue in the Dark? That's the German translation of it. But it's basically a large hall that is completely absent of light. And what they have are some scenes in there. There's a market scene. There's a scene inside of a house. There's even a boat ride that you can take. And it's completely without light. So when you enter this as someone going to this exhibit, it simulates what it might be like to be blind, because you can't see your hand in front of your face for about an hour and a half. And it's a really interesting experience that gives you empathy for what it's like to be blind. So we actually go out of our way to gain empathy for other people. This is something that we're willing to pay for. And of course, in UX design, right, empathy for the user. We heard a little bit about empathy this morning, right, having empathy for the customers and the users. But what I want to suggest is I think you need empathy for your team as well, too. You need to have that shared understanding, the different perspectives that have to come together, because design is a full contact sport. Right? This idea of the lone designer who's going to, go away and voila, come up with the best design in the world, that's not going to happen. You're working with other people. So we're talking about collaboration here, and radical collaboration. And I think part of it has to do with empathy. And with that comes a whole host of other things: trust, respect, even humility as well too. So the question I have is how do we gain empathy for the people that we work with? Well, what do we do in particular? And I think sometimes we overlook that quite a bit, and we like to point fingers quicker than gaining empathy. I think hanging out, and jazz musicians hang out all the time, and getting to know people on a personal level is super helpful. But also understanding the different roles in the band, and I think that's what makes this experiment here work so well, is that I know my role as a bass player, and Andy knows his role, so that we're very clear, and we're also clear on how they interact with one another. And we also know that if we weren't here together, we wouldn't have this music. So there's this kind of desired outcome that we share, right? We know our place and our contribution to that, and that allows us to understand each other's roles. Right. So we're going to play another tune. And here's what I want you to do, and this is the way to listen to jazz, actually. Listen to each one of the instruments in isolation. So as we go around, take 30 seconds or a minute and listen to one player, and then go to the next player, and then go to the next player. Just listen to that person, kind of give your attention to that one person, and see what their role is. See if you can think about what is their role in the music, what is their contribution to the music. And we're going to play. What do you guys want to play? I think we'll play There Is No Greater Love. Okay. This is a 32-bar AABA form called There Is No Greater Love. But listen as we go around and play. Listen to each one of us individually. Also, in jazz, they have this concept of big ears. And what big ears means is that when you're playing, you're actually listening to everybody else, and you may be listening to them more than you're listening to yourself. And what the big ears mentality allows you to do is be able to react to the other people. So listen how when Ben plays something, how the drums might react to that, or when there's a a harmonic or a dynamic change that causes an effect in the other musicians as well too. Because we're constantly in real time, we're constantly in tune with everybody else here up on stage. So big ears. Excellent. Yeah, how about those solos? Andy Haig on drums, Jim Blomfield, Ben Waghorn. Yeah, that's great. So this is possible, right? Again, we have not rehearsed. We just met about an hour ago. And we're already starting to feel a dynamic between us. We're listening to each other. We're starting to stretch out a little bit. It doesn't take very long. We have those frameworks where those frameworks are a safety net for us so that we're embracing uncertainty and we're listening. We're listening to everything that's going on. In that last tune, it's usually unusual for the bass to take the first solo, but Jim looked up at me and went like this, and I said, okay. So I took the first solo. We didn't know that was going to happen, right? But we kind of figured out, okay, if I'm taking the first solo, one of these guys are going to take the second solo. And then that drum solo, I was thinking of 4. I think you were thinking of 8s or 4s or something, right? But then we just all kind of stopped. So we gave Andy the whole chorus. Andy took that whole chorus, right? So we didn't trade off 4s. We didn't know that was going to happen either. But we knew where we were, and we were just listening to each other and just really attuned to what was going on there. And I think if we continued playing together, we'd find some interesting new things that have never been played before. Right, so how do we gain empathy for other people in our teams? And I guess the message that I want to leave you with is not thinking about empathy for the customer, but think about the empathy for your team. So before you point that finger or pound your fist about that engineer that just doesn't get it, right? What is it that he doesn't get? You know what I mean? Try to understand that, right? Because ultimately, the stuff that we deliver is a team effort. Right? It's all about collaboration. If you don't have that collaboration and that teamwork, your designs aren't going out the door. So Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, likened a business leader to an orchestra conductor. So I think when we think about leadership as well, too, we can get a lesson up on stage here. There is no leader here. Who's the leader of this group? As soon as we count off, we're all in it together. And that's what happened in the Miles story. Right? They were all in that song together, and when Herbie Hancock played a wrong note, it didn't matter if it was him or somebody else. They were all in it together. It's our sound that comes out off the stage. We're all part of this, and I think we need to get away from this idea of the leader as a conductor, and we can have leadership from within, and that's what teams like at Spotify are doing. Have you seen this diagram from Spotify? Right? They're kind of flattening the structure. Even though they're fairly large organizations, they're organized around squads, right? And guilds and tribes, right? This doesn't look like a typical org chart, right? And they don't behave like a typical organization. They're empowered. These small teams are empowered, just like we're empowered. We can push this music in any direction that we want, any one of us. And if people are empathetic to it and listening to it, the music will go in that direction. Here's an even more extreme example, the company Valve. Does anybody read their employee manual? Go Google the employee manual for the gaming company called Valve. It's full of language like this. I'm not your boss. You don't report to me. This is the founder of the company saying this. You don't report to anyone. This company is yours to steer in any direction that you want to, right? So I think this is the new norm, and we see organizations, and it doesn't have to be small organizations or cool web organizations. This can apply to any organization, the idea of working together as a team and empowering that team. And this also has to do with who we're working with and who we're hiring as well, too. This is an interesting article where he's talking about, he calls this the age of humanity, where we're going to be hiring people based on their passion and based on their ability to collaborate. Right? And I know sometimes those are interview questions that we have, but how do we really know if the person that we're hiring is going to be able to collaborate with us? Right? Because that's the secret sauce of any organization, is how well those teams can collaborate. You can go for the rock star unicorn, right? But Johnny Ives is busy, right? For most of us, we're going to have to do with what we have, that team, and it can be done with teamwork. So hiring people for collaborative spirit, right? And also management. I talked a little bit about leadership. Here, Rita Gunther McGrath also talking about the age of execution and the age of expertise, moving from the industrial era to the information era. And she says we're moving into an era of empathy, where managers are going to have to be empathetic of their teams and of the people that they work with as well, too. So this isn't a nice to have. This isn't a fluffy UX topic talking about empathy and teamwork and collaboration. This is vital for the future of organizations, I believe. So we need to think more like a jam session. So that's kind of what we wanted to demonstrate up here, is how a group of people can come together and spontaneously create music. I believe it rests on the fact that we know these patterns and we have a common goal that then allows us to embrace uncertainty. But we're listening in real time the whole time. We're listening to each other. So thank you.